Came to Thanksgiving dinner with a spreadsheet. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean my son's girlfriend of 4 months actually pulled out a printed document, laminated, and slid it across my dining room table between the cranberry sauce and the sweet potato casserole, while my wife was still carrying dishes in from the kitchen. I remember sitting there for a moment looking at it, then looking at her. Her name was Serena. She had a firm handshake, expensive highlights, and the kind of smile that arrives before the warmth does. She'd walked into my house that afternoon like she was walking into a property she was already mentally redecorating. I noticed. I always notice. 40 years in commercial real estate teaches you to read a room and the people standing in it. My son Adrian was 31. Good kid. Sharp. A little too trusting. Worked as a structural engineer for a firm downtown. He'd met Serena at a conference in Atlanta 8 weeks after his last relationship ended. They'd been dating since March. It was now November. The spreadsheet had a title. I read it twice to make sure I was understanding correctly. Proposed family investment, wedding and future planning. Year 1. I set it down. I picked up my water glass. I took a long, slow sip. Then I looked across the table at Adrian. He was staring at his plate. Not in an embarrassed way. In the way a man stares at something when he's trying very hard not to make eye contact with his father because he already knows what his father is going to think. That told me everything. Serena began talking. She clearly rehearsed this. She spoke about how weddings in her family were legacy events, how her parents had always envisioned a celebration that reflected the family's values, how she'd done extensive research into venues, catering, floral arrangements, and destination options. She mentioned a resort in Tuscany. She mentioned a reception minimum for 300 guests. She mentioned a number. $1.8 million. My wife had just walked in from the kitchen carrying a basket of rolls. I heard her set it down on the counter behind me instead of on the table. She didn't come any closer. I didn't say anything right away. That's another thing 40 years in business teaches you. The person who speaks first after a number is named almost always loses. So I let the silence sit there, right in the middle of my Thanksgiving table, next to the laminated spreadsheet and the cranberry sauce. Serena filled it. That told me something too. She said her family had certain expectations. She said Adrian had assured her that my wife and I were in a position to help. She said she didn't want to be indelicate, but she believed in being direct about financial matters early in a relationship, to avoid misunderstandings later. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I'd heard almost those exact words before from a contractor who tried to overbill me on a warehouse renovation in 2009. Same posture, same rehearsed reasonableness, same assumption that framing theft as transparency made it something else. I folded my hands on the table. I said, Serena, where are your parents on all this? The first crack, small but there. She said her parents were supportive, of course, but that the groom's family traditionally covered the majority of expenses in her family's culture. I asked which culture that was. She said it was a generational thing, more than anything, a values thing. I nodded slowly. And what does Adrian think about the budget? She started to answer, but before she could get the first word out, Adrian reached under the table and pressed something into my hand. A napkin. Folded into quarters. I kept my face completely still. I've played poker. I know how to receive information without broadcasting it. I closed my fingers around the napkin and kept my eyes on Serena while she explained something about deposit timelines and venue availability windows for the following autumn. I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway, I unfolded the napkin. Adrian's handwriting. Cramped, rushed. The way you write something fast while someone is looking at their phone. Dad, I need to talk to you alone. I didn't agree to any of this. She's been spending from our joint account. I don't know how much. Please don't say yes to anything. I stood there in my own hallway for a moment, holding that napkin, and felt something settle into place in my chest. Not panic, not anger. Something colder and clearer than either of those. I folded it back up. Put it in my shirt pocket. Walked back to the table. I told Serena that my wife and I would need some time to review the document. I thanked her for being so thorough. I said I admired people who thought ahead. I smiled the whole time. She smiled back, and I could see her reading that smile as agreement. It wasn't agreement, it was the beginning of something else entirely. That night, after Serena had gone home and my wife was cleaning up the kitchen, Adrian sat down at my desk and told me everything. It took almost 2 hours. He and Serena had opened a joint account in September, 2 months after they started dating, because she'd suggested it made sense for shared expenses, groceries, utilities for the apartment she'd essentially moved into, weekend trips. He'd deposited $8,000 to start. He hadn't checked the balance in 6 weeks. He checked it that night, sitting at my desk while I watched. $3,100 remaining. Nearly $5,000 gone in 6 weeks. He pulled up the transaction history. A spa in Buckhead. A clothing boutique in Midtown he'd never heard of. 2 airline tickets to Nashville for a girls' weekend with a friend, which Adrian had not known about. A furniture store. A kitchen appliance he'd never seen in the apartment. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. I thought I was being romantic, he said. She made it seem like couples do this. Some couples do, I said. 4 months in, without a conversation about limits is not how it's done. I know that now. How long has she been talking about this wedding? He rubbed his face with both hands. Since about week 6. I thought about that. Week 6 of a relationship. Most people are still figuring out each other's coffee orders at week 6. Over the next 3 evenings, I asked Adrian to write down every financial interaction he'd had with Serena since March. Not from memory alone. From bank statements, his credit card history, text messages where she'd asked for things. The total, when we added it up, was just over $22,000. Some of it was the joint account. Some of it was direct Venmo requests she'd sent him for things that had never materialized. A deposit on a vacation rental they'd never taken. Half the cost of concert tickets that had turned out not to exist. A loan to help her cousin that her cousin, when Adrian mentioned it casually in conversation months later, had no knowledge of. $22,000 in 7 months. And now she was sitting at my Thanksgiving table with a laminated spreadsheet asking for $1.8 million more. I called my attorney the following Monday, not to file anything yet, just to understand my son's position. My attorney, a man I've worked with for 20 years, asked me to get him documentation. I told him we had plenty. He said start with the joint account records and anything in writing. I also made one other phone call. I reached out to a former colleague of mine, a woman who'd worked in financial compliance before retiring. I described the pattern without using any names. She listened, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's a textbook affinity fraud progression. Small trust-building transactions that escalate to a large ask. Has she talked about a timeline for the big number?" I told her about the deposit deadlines on the spreadsheet. Venues needed to be booked by January. She said, "There it is. Urgency is always part of it." I thanked her and hung up. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. At no point during any of this did I hate Serena. Hate is a feeling that requires you to be surprised, and I stopped being surprised by this type of behavior a long time ago. What I felt was something more like a professional obligation. She had come into my family with a plan, and now I had a counterplan, and one of those plans was going to reach its conclusion, and one was not. I kept up normal contact with her for 3 weeks. I replied to her texts cordially. I let her believe that my wife and I were discussing the proposal. My son kept the relationship surface-level stable while we built documentation. I want to be clear that Adrian made that choice himself. He's not a passive person. He was angry, but he was also strategic, and watching him make that shift, from hurt to focused, was something I won't forget. In mid-December, Serena invited herself to our Christmas party. Not asked, invited herself, and then mentioned to Adrian that she'd already told her mother she was coming. She arrived with a gift for my wife and spent 40 minutes talking to our accountant, a man named, well, I'll just call him our accountant, about investment structures and tax-advantaged vehicles. in a way that made it clear she was sizing up the family's financial architecture. I watched from across the room. She was good. I'll give her that. Our accountant caught my eye at one point and gave me the smallest nod. He'd noticed, too. After the party, he pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "That young woman asked me 3 specific questions that you only ask if you're trying to figure out how assets are held and whether they're accessible." I said, "I know." He said, "Should I be concerned?" I said, "Not for long." By early January, my attorney had reviewed everything Adrian had compiled. The unauthorized transactions from the joint account were clear. The Venmo transfers, cross-reference with Adrian's records, and the absence of any corresponding goods or services painted a precise picture. My attorney said that depending on how we wanted to proceed, there were civil options, and depending on whether a pattern could be established across other relationships, which we didn't know yet, there might be grounds for law enforcement involvement. I told him I wanted to do this methodically. He said that was the right call. What happened next was something I hadn't expected, and I'll give credit where it's due. It wasn't my doing. Adrian found a text thread on his tablet. Serena had logged into her messages on his device weeks earlier to show him something and had forgotten to log out. He wasn't snooping. He picked up the tablet to check a work email, and her messages were open. What he read was a conversation between Serena and a woman whose name I'll leave out, in which Serena referred to Adrian as the engineer, discussed the progress of the plan, mentioned that she'd gotten close with the family, and that the father was old money, careful, but the son is soft, and outlined her intention to get a wedding deposit secured before the window closes in spring. Adrian took screenshots. He sent them to himself. He closed the app and set the tablet down and went for a drive for about an hour. When he came back, he sat down with me and showed me everything. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "No, but I'm ready." We met with my attorney the following week. Adrian had prepared a detailed timeline with documentation. The screenshots, the bank records, the Venmo history, the written request, Serena's laminated spreadsheet, which had been conveniently emailed to Adrian as a PDF, meaning we had a time-stamped digital record of the demand. My attorney filed a civil complaint in late January. Unjust enrichment. Fraudulent misrepresentation. The evidence was clean and the paper trail was unambiguous. Adrian ended the relationship the same day the filing was made. He did it in person because he's that kind of man. He said she denied everything initially, then shifted to saying it was all a misunderstanding, then said she'd get her people to respond to the legal action, then cried. He stood there through all of it and said what he'd come to say and left. She called me 3 times that evening. I didn't answer any of them. What I will tell you is what my attorney told me 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a phone call that lasted about 7 minutes. The civil judgment came down in our favor. The court found that Serena had taken funds from the joint account under circumstances consistent with fraudulent intent, and that the Venmo transfers lacked documentation of the consideration she'd claimed. She was ordered to repay $22,400 in restitution. That was only part of it. Because it turned out my former colleague's instinct had been right. Serena had done this before. Not identically. The details varied, but the structure was the same. A previous relationship in another state, a pattern of escalating financial requests, a large sum that had been transferred just before that relationship ended. That man had never taken legal action. Once our filing became a matter of record, he came forward. Serena was charged with wire fraud. I'm not going to walk through the legal proceedings in detail because some of that is still a matter I've been asked not to discuss publicly. What I can tell you is that the charge was serious, the evidence was substantial, and the outcome was not good for her. My son is fine, more than fine. He told me recently that the whole experience, as painful as it was, taught him something he couldn't have learned any other way about who he is when things go wrong. He said he was proud of how he handled it. I told him he should be. My wife, who has the patience of someone who has been married to me for 36 years and therefore has patience to spare, said to me one evening in the spring after everything had settled, "You knew at Thanksgiving, didn't you?" I said, "I had a feeling." She said, "When she walked in or when she pulled out the spreadsheet?" I thought about it honestly. "When she walked in," I said. "The spreadsheet just confirmed it." My wife shook her head slowly, not in a disapproving way, in the way she does when something turns out exactly as she expected, but she still finds it slightly exhausting. All those years in real estate, she said. You never did learn to turn that off. I told her I hoped I never would. There are people in this world who look at a family, at the work and the years and the trust built between people who love each other, and see an opportunity. They are patient and they are practiced, and they count on you being too polite or too hopeful or too much in love with the idea of what they're pretending to be, to look clearly at what they actually are. I am 63 years old. I have built things slowly and watched fast-talking people try to dismantle them my entire career. I know what a practiced smile looks like. I know what laminated urgency looks like. And I know, with absolute certainty, that the most dangerous ask is always the one dressed up to look like a gift. Serena walked into my house on Thanksgiving carrying a spreadsheet and a plan. She left with neither. I still have that napkin. It's folded in the back of my desk drawer, behind a stack of old closing documents and a pen that stopped working years ago. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because it reminds me that the most important moments in a life rarely announce themselves. They arrive on folded paper, passed under a table, while someone across from you is explaining deposit timelines. What happened to Serena wasn't bad luck. I want to be clear about that. It was the natural endpoint of a change she herself had been building, link by link, since the day she walked into my son's life with a plan instead of genuine feeling. Every transaction she made, the spa visits charged to a joint account he trusted her with, the concert tickets that never existed, the cousin who knew nothing about the loan, every one of those choices was a brick in a wall that eventually fell on her. That's not fate. That's not punishment from some outside force. That's just the math of how choices compound over time. You build something dishonest long enough, and eventually the structure can't hold its own weight. What I keep coming back to is Adrian, not Serena. Adrian. Because the easy version of this story is about a con artist getting caught. But the harder, truer version is about a young man who had to look at something painful and choose not to look away from it. When he handed me that napkin, he wasn't just asking for help. He was admitting to himself in real time that something he'd believed in was not what it appeared to be. That takes a kind of honesty that most people avoid their whole lives. It's easier to explain away the withdrawals. It's easier to tell yourself the timeline is normal. It's easier to want the story you hope for badly enough that you stop reading the one actually in front of you. Adrian didn't do that. He looked clearly, and then, when we had the full picture, he didn't collapse and he didn't explode. He got organized. He got methodical. He sat at my desk for 3 evenings and turned his hurt into documentation because he understood that feelings don't win cases, evidence does. That kind of discipline, choosing to be precise when everything in you wants to just react, is something you can't teach a person directly. They either find it in themselves when it matters or they don't. He found it. I think about the version of this where he never passed me that napkin, where he let Serena answer my question about what her own parents were contributing and just absorbed whatever she said and kept going, where the January deposit deadline came and went, and somehow we were all committed to something none of us had actually agreed to. It's not hard to imagine. It happens in families every day, not because people are foolish, but because hope is a powerful editor. It cuts the parts that don't fit the story you want. The thing I'd want anyone to take from what happened in my house is this. Integrity isn't just about what you refuse to do to other people. It's also about what you refuse to do to yourself. Refusing to lie to yourself about what the numbers say. Refusing to let embarrassment keep you from asking the one question that changes everything. And when the answer comes back wrong, when the napkin says what Adrian's napkin said, having the steadiness to deal with it without losing yourself in the process. Serena walked out of our lives owing $22,000 and facing a federal charge. Adrian walked out of it knowing exactly who he is under pressure. I know which outcome I'd trade for.